Welcome to Write with Harte. I am Jenna Harte, a romance author and romance ghostwriter. Over the last 2 years, I've written over 2.5 million swoon-worthy words, and I am here to share some of my tips and insights to help you write a romance. My goal with this show is to provide you with tangible, usable tips, tricks, hacks, information that you can take and use right away in your own romance manuscript. This week, I want to do a Write Tight segment, which is designed to help you beef up your writing so that it is stronger and more interesting to your readers. Today we're going to cover passive voice, which, despite what you might hear, isn't always wrong. I'm going to cover what is passive voice, why it's generally discouraged, how you can quickly identify it in your manuscript so you can fix it if you need to, and some situations in which you might actually want to use passive voice. So let's get started. First, let's talk about what passive voice is. Passive voice is when the subject is being acted upon by some other person, entity, or situation that is doing the action. And if you are paying attention, you might note that that sentence I just said was actually a passive sentence. As I said earlier, passive sentences aren't wrong. So you might wonder, why is there so many people out there telling you to get rid of them? The potential problem of a passive sentence is that it weakens your writing. It's basically a sentence that has all the oomph or wind taken out of it. When writing a romance, keeping your readers immersed and active in the story is really important, and weak sentences just don't do that. Let me give you an example of a few sentences that are passive so you have a sense of what I mean. The tree was blown down by the wind. Now, because we're talking about romance here, let's go ahead and choose a couple of sentences that might be found in a romance novel. He was hurt by her rejection. She was overwhelmed by his passion. Now, particularly those romance sentences, they're not bad, but they could be stronger. Stronger sentences have a tendency to hook your reader and keep them deeper into the story. So let's go ahead and turn those sentences around from passive voice to active voice. The wind blew down the tree. And then using our romance sentences, her rejection hurt him. His passion overwhelmed her. These sentences are much more direct because the subject is actually doing what the verb is talking about. The other thing is we actually have a stronger verb. In our passive sentences, it's to be. He was, she was. But when we turn it around into an active sentence, we have the wind blew, the rejection hurt, his passion overwhelmed. So we have subject, strong verb there. Now, of course, one of the challenges is going through your manuscript and finding passive sentences, weak sentences, adverbs, all those other things that people tell you you need to do during revision. It's mind-boggling, the things that you have to do. And for me, when I go through and read my manuscript over and over and over again, I tend to read what I intended to write, so I miss a lot of the spelling errors or homonym errors. But I also will read through my passive sentences. So I have found a trick to help me identify them so that I can quickly go to them, check them, and see if I have to fix them. So there are basically two common parts to a passive sentence. The one you're going to find the most often is the use of a to be verb. So that's is, was, were, had been. Okay, so any form of the to be verb often will highlight for you a passive sentence. Now, not every sentence that uses a to be verb is passive, but in most cases, your passive sentences are going to have a to be verb in it. The other word that your passive sentence may or may not have is the word by. If we go back to our examples, the tree was blown down by the wind. He was hurt by her rejection. She was overwhelmed by his passion. So you can see all those sentences met all that criteria. Now, you may or may not have the word by, and you can look for that, but generally a to be verb is going to be a part of a passive sentence. So now that you know that, how can you easily make them stand out in your manuscript? Well, you can read your manuscript and stop at every form of the to be verb, but if you're like me, you might end up reading through it. I actually prefer to use my find function, and I will go through and put each version of the verb in there. So if I am writing in past tense, I will put in was. And of course, my manuscript's going to light up because it's a word that is used a lot. And you might think, that's crazy, that's too much. But if you're going to be reading it anyway, what's the big deal if the was or all other to be verbs ended up lit up so that you can easily identify them? You can go to the sentence, you can determine if it's passive or not, fix it to a stronger verb if you can, and then move on, or leave it. Now, one of the reasons that people dissuade you from using passive voice is it's weak and it's often vague as well. But sometimes there are situations in which the passive voice is used and makes sense to be used and wouldn't be considered making your sentence weak. So I want to give you a few examples where you might want to use the passive voice. One example is if the person doing the action is unknown. For example, she was mugged. Okay, we don't know who mugged her. We just know she was mugged. Now, you could make that an active sentence, someone mugged her, but she was mugged is certainly an acceptable way to say what happened to her when we don't know who did the mugging. A second reason you might want to use a passive sentence is if the action in the sentence is actually more important than who is doing the action. The example that's used most often is the president was sworn in. The person doing the swearing in isn't as important as the action of the president being sworn in. Another reason to use passive voice is you want to be vague about who is responsible for doing the action. A common example of this is mistakes were made. So that basically says, I didn't make mistakes. They were made. Somebody made them, and makes the mistake making kind of vague. A fourth reason to use passive voice is if you're saying a general or universal truth that everyone would accept. Chocolate is meant to be eaten. Now, I want to highlight in these few examples that I've given you that the word by hasn't been used in any of the sentences that I've just said. However, they can be added or inferred. She was mugged by someone. The president was sworn in by the Chief Justice. Mistakes were made by somebody else. Chocolate is meant to be eaten by everyone. Now, a final reason you might want to use the passive voice is to put off the subject doing the action until the end of the sentence. I use this sometimes in my mysteries to delay a revelation. So, for example, he was murdered by dun 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 Joe. That is a passive sentence, but in that sentence is I'm telling you who the murderer is. Now, I can say Joe is the murderer, but there's something to holding it off, drawing it out, so you're waited with bated breath to find out who was the murderer. So that's my quick tips on passive voice. Hopefully you have some insights on when to use it and when not to use it, and why it's important to search your manuscript for it to see if you might be able to rewrite those sentences into something that is much stronger and much more likely to really hook your reader in and immerse them into your story. If you did find this tip helpful, I hope that you will like and subscribe so that you can come back and see more great tips and insights and other information that I share on writing romance. And of course, if you have any feedback, questions, comments, or maybe even more information to share, please let me know in the comments below. For more great tips and tidbits, please visit writewithharte.com. That's Harte in my name, HARTE.com, where there's lots of great stuff over there for you to check out to help you write your romance. Thanks so much for joining me. Until next time, this is Jenna Harte wishing you peace, love, and happily ever after.